The morning sun rose over the bustling port city of Formia, casting long golden rays across the tiled rooftops and the winding streets filled with merchants and travelers. Bishop Erasmus stood at the edge of the cliff overlooking the harbor, the salty wind whipping against his long, dark hair, strands sticking to his sweat-soaked face. At 43, his face bore both the wisdom and the weight of responsibility. His sharp features and piercing eyes had guided countless Christians through seasons of peril. Today, however, an uneasy tension gripped him more tightly than any storm at sea. Rumors had spread like wildfire. Imperial edicts demanding that all Christians renounce their faith had reached even the smallest villages. Erasmus, as bishop, was a symbol of resistance, and he knew that the Romans would soon set their eyes on him. He descended the cobbled streets toward the cathedral, each step echoing against the ancient stone walls. His mind a tempest of fear, determination, and sorrow. The city itself was alive with subtle signs of apprehension. Shutters closed hastily, whispers in the marketplaces, a tension in the posture of ordinary citizens who once moved freely without fear. As Erasmus entered the cathedral, the scent of candle wax and incense enveloped him, and he noticed a small gathering of faithful awaiting his sermon. Their eyes reflected a mixture of awe, hope, and dread. They too had heard of the edicts. He took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of his pastoral mantle settle across his shoulders. In the quiet of the sanctuary, Erasmus recited silent prayers, seeking guidance for the weeks to come. He thought of the past, how Christianity had grown from a whispered secret into a visible, undeniable presence in the Roman world. He remembered the teachings of his mentors, the courage of martyrs whose stories had fortified his spirit, and the vision of a community rooted in compassion, resilience, and unwavering faith. His sermons had often drawn large crowds, including the curious and skeptical. Today, he realized, every word might carry consequences far beyond spiritual edification. As he emerged from the cathedral, Erasmus noticed a group of children playing near the fountain. Their laughter seemed incongruous with the anxiety that hung over the city like a thick fog. One small boy tripped, scraping his knee, and Erasmus stooped instinctively to help, masking his own apprehension with gentle words and a smile. The boy's mother watched, tears glistening in her eyes, grateful for the calm presence of their shepherd in such uncertain times. Even in the shadow of persecution, the simple acts of care reminded Erasmus of the humanity he was sworn to protect. By mid-morning, word came that Roman soldiers were stationed near the main gates, their armor gleaming in the harsh sunlight. Rumors of their mission reached Erasmus, a list of names, each one marked for interrogation or arrest. Among them, his own name was circled. The thought struck him like a thunderclap. The empire was moving decisively, and he had no choice but to act. Gathering a small group of trusted clergy, Erasmus discussed the possibility of temporary retreat, seeking refuge in the mountains beyond the city. The decision was painful. To leave was to abandon the flock temporarily, yet staying would invite immediate capture and possibly death. Night fell as Erasmus and his companions packed what little they could carry. Cloaks for warmth, provisions, and precious scriptures. The streets were quiet, lit only by the dim glow of oil lamps. Shadows danced along the walls, mimicking the tension that churned within his chest. He paused one last time at the cathedral door, pressing a hand to the cool stone, whispering a prayer of protection over his city and his people. The journey ahead would be grueling, a test of endurance that would push him to the limits of body and spirit. The ascent to the mountains was treacherous. Narrow paths carved into the cliffs, slippery with morning mist, forced careful navigation. Erasmus led the way, his long robe snagging on jagged rocks, yet his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. Around him, the faint sounds of the city receded, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of footsteps and the occasional cry of a mountain bird. Hunger and exhaustion gnawed at their group, but Erasmus remained resolute, offering words of encouragement and reassurance, reminding them that perseverance was itself an act of faith. In the solitude of a rocky alcove, they set up a temporary shelter. Erasmus knelt to examine the scarce water supply trickling from a hidden spring, noting how the life-giving resource, though meager, might sustain them for days. He instructed his companions on rationing and foraging, while mentally mapping routes for further retreat if necessary. Here, in isolation, he found moments for reflection. The looming threat of persecution, the suffering endured by his flock, and the moral weight of leadership pressed upon him. Each decision carried profound consequences, yet he drew strength from a conviction that faith demanded courage beyond fear. By the third night, The group had adapted to the harsh conditions. Erasmus maintained a strict schedule of prayer, meditation, and study, composing letters to distant churches to maintain a line of spiritual guidance despite physical separation. Stories of miraculous providence had begun to circulate among his companions: hidden fruit trees, sudden rainfall quenching thirst, and the occasional protection from natural hazards that might have ended lesser men. To Erasmus, these were signs not of personal glory but of divine oversight and encouragement. Every challenge became an opportunity to model resilience and unwavering commitment to principles larger than oneself. Evenings were the hardest. The darkness seemed to press in on the thin shelter, amplifying every rustle of wind or distant howl. Erasmus often lay awake, contemplating the future. He visualized the city, his congregation, the streets emptying under the soldiers' watchful eyes. Yet even in these moments, he practiced discipline of the mind and heart. Fear acknowledged but not indulged. Hope cultivated through prayer and contemplation. His companions, inspired by his calm amidst adversity, began to emulate his demeanor, creating a silent network of support that fortified the small group against the psychological pressures of exile. By the end of the first week, Erasmus had established routines that ensured survival and spiritual continuity. Each day balanced the pragmatic, gathering food, tending to wounds, maintaining shelter, with the transcendent, prayer, teaching, and reflection on the teachings of Christ. Though the mountain refuge offered safety from immediate capture, it also symbolized the precariousness of human life in the face of imperial power. Erasmus's mind was never far from the reality that, eventually, a confrontation with the authorities might be unavoidable. Yet he remained determined to lead with wisdom, courage, and faith, no matter the cost. The mountains stretched endlessly before Erasmus and his companions, a jagged fortress of rock and mist that both shielded and tested them. By the second week of exile, the initial fear of immediate capture had shifted into a constant gnawing tension. Every rustle of wind through the pines, every distant echo was a potential harbinger of Roman patrols. Erasmus, despite the physical exhaustion etched into his face, maintained an aura of calm authority. His sharp eyes scanned the horizon tirelessly, noting every trail, every sign of human presence, while his mind mapped out contingencies should they be discovered. The journey had grown harsher. Rain fell in sudden torrents, soaking robes and chilling them to the bone. The group huddled under rocky overhangs, rationing meager supplies of bread, dried fruit, and spring water. Erasmus took upon himself the responsibility of moral support, quietly encouraging companions through the long nights, reminding them of the spiritual fortitude they had cultivated. He spoke of patience, of endurance, of the unseen providence that guided them through dangers mortal men could scarcely understand. To those around him, the bishop became not just a leader, but a beacon of hope in the oppressive shadow of imperial wrath. One evening, as the wind howled through the mountain pass, Erasmus received word from a secret messenger. A small village nearby had been raided, Christian families taken, some executed. The news struck a chord of anguish deep within him. He thought of the innocents, the children and elders who would suffer for no crime but faith. He realized that staying in hiding, while preserving his own life, could indirectly allow greater suffering to occur. The weight of leadership pressed upon him more heavily than ever. The decision to remain or return loomed like a storm cloud. As the group navigated treacherous paths, Erasmus began composing letters on scraps of parchment, sealing them with wax and entrusting them to trusted messengers who could carry guidance to scattered congregations. His handwriting was careful, deliberate, each stroke imbued with thought and prayer. These letters contained counsel on faith, encouragement in the face of persecution, and detailed warnings of Roman patrol movements. Despite the constant threat of discovery, Erasmus found solace in the act of maintaining the spiritual lifeline for his people. Each letter he wrote was a tether connecting him to his flock, a silent promise that they would not be abandoned. The hardships of exile extended beyond immediate threats. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, and the mountain terrain demanded constant exertion. Erasmus found himself meditating on the fragile boundary between physical endurance and spiritual resilience. He observed how his companions struggled with despair, how fear could twist their minds, and how small victories, finding a hidden spring, a patch of edible roots, offered profound emotional relief. He nurtured these moments, using them to cultivate morale, teaching that survival was as much about psychological fortitude as it was about physical sustenance. One afternoon, They stumbled upon a narrow ravine where the path had been washed out by recent rains. Erasmus surveyed the obstacle, considering the safest route, weighing risk against necessity. His long robe snagged repeatedly on jagged rocks, yet he remained composed, offering hands to pull companions up steep inclines, steadying those who faltered. The physical strain was immense, but the bishop's unwavering demeanor reinforced a sense of discipline and hope. Each successful navigation of the treacherous terrain became a metaphor for spiritual perseverance, a lesson in trusting divine guidance amidst life-threatening trials. Nightfall brought new challenges. The cold pierced through cloaks. Sleep was fitful and shadows seemed to dance with ominous intent. Erasmus would often lie awake, contemplating the city he had left behind, the persecution continuing unchecked, and the growing responsibility he bore. Yet, in these moments, he cultivated an inner clarity, rehearsing sermons, envisioning the words that would strengthen his community once he returned. His mind balanced strategic planning with spiritual reflection, each reinforcing the other. By the end of the second week, a pattern had emerged. The group relied on Erasmus not only for guidance and inspiration, but also for practical survival strategies. He demonstrated how to find hidden water, recognize edible plants, and detect subtle signs of approaching patrols. His ability to blend careful observation with theological reflection created an environment in which fear did not dominate, but vigilance and hope coexisted. He taught that spiritual insight and worldly prudence were not mutually exclusive, but complementary in the harsh reality of exile. Amidst these trials, whispers of divine intervention began to circulate. Companions spoke of miraculous events, a sudden break in the storm, a hidden food cache discovered at the right moment, and the inexplicable preservation of health despite harsh conditions. Erasmus, ever humble, attributed these occurrences not to personal power, but to the providence of God, using each event to reinforce faith, courage, and resilience. Even the youngest in the group began to internalize lessons of patience, endurance, and the importance of trust in forces beyond human understanding. The serene silence of the mountains was shattered one morning by distant clanging of armor and the rhythmic pounding of hooves. Roman patrols had grown bolder, their scouts combing the rugged terrain with a precision that spoke of ruthless efficiency. Erasmus, ever vigilant, immediately gathered his companions, instructing them to move into narrow passes and shadowed gullies where visibility was limited. His sharp gaze swept the horizon, noting the sun's position, the angles of rock faces, and the likely paths of the approaching soldiers. Every step required meticulous calculation. One wrong movement could spell capture or worse, a death that would serve as a public spectacle. The psychological toll of constant pursuit weighed heavily on the group. Sleep became fragmented, food was scarce, and the relentless cold and rain tested both body and spirit. Yet Erasmus maintained his calm. His presence radiated an almost tangible authority, a steadying force in the face of relentless danger. He reminded his companions that fear could be harnessed, transformed into focus and survival. He spoke often of patience, faith, and the virtue of endurance. Every whispered prayer, every small act of guidance, reinforced the invisible tether connecting them to their beliefs and to one another. On the third day, they stumbled upon a cliffside cave that offered temporary sanctuary. Erasmus examined it carefully, noting signs of previous habitation and potential hazards. He rationed the remaining supplies with methodical care, distributing water and scraps of bread with fairness and consideration. Companions huddled together, shivering as the bishop recounted stories of past martyrs whose unwavering faith had brought hope to oppressed communities. His voice, calm yet resolute, transformed fear into courage, weaving an invisible shield of morale that bolstered their resolve against imminent threat. As the Romans closed in, Erasmus realized that evasion alone could not be the sole strategy. He began to consider more proactive measures, creating diversions, misleading patrols, and using the terrain to advantage. He set small traps, rock slides, and false tracks to confuse pursuers, each devised with an understanding of physics and human expectation. These subtle tactics were effective not because they caused harm, but because they delayed capture, granting precious time for survival. Erasmus's mind worked ceaselessly, balancing immediate safety with long-term objectives, reflecting a strategic acumen honed under extreme conditions. A sense of urgency grew with every hour. Erasmus and his companions moved stealthily through narrow passes, across frozen streams, and under jagged overhangs. The mountain itself seemed both ally and adversary, offering shelter while testing endurance. The bishop's presence inspired vigilance. Each movement was deliberate, each pause purposeful. The companions learned to anticipate his subtle signals: a lifted hand, a glance toward a particular rock formation, a whispered word guiding them through hidden paths. Erasmus became not just a leader, but a conductor orchestrating survival amidst peril. At night, the cold intensified, and the threat of ambush became palpable. Erasmus taught his companions to create small, concealed fires, to mask their scent and presence, and to rest in shifts. He emphasized alertness over comfort, reinforcing the need for strategic patience. Despite the harsh conditions, moments of reflection and prayer offered psychological sustenance. The bishop would sit for hours, eyes closed, quietly reinforcing his own spiritual resilience while silently transmitting that calm to those around him. The mountains echoed with whispered psalms and muted prayers, a chorus of hope amid danger. The true test came when the patrols managed to corner them near a narrow ridge overlooking a sheer drop. The companions froze, fear etched into every face. Erasmus stepped forward calmly, scanning the path below, calculating the smallest margin for error. He instructed them to descend slowly, using every foothold and handhold, balancing courage with caution. The Romans, observing from a distance, could see only the shadows of the fugitives, never grasping their exact number or position. The psychological warfare, the tension of anticipation and uncertainty, became a subtle but powerful tool in Erasmus's survival strategy. By the end of the chapter, Erasmus had transformed a group of exhausted fugitives into a disciplined, cohesive unit capable of enduring both environmental hazards and psychological pressure. The bishop's leadership demonstrated a synthesis of practical wisdom, spiritual fortitude, and unyielding courage. He had learned to manipulate fear, turning it from a paralyzing force into a catalyst for survival, and to teach others to do the same. The Roman threat, though ever present, became less a source of despair and more a measure of their growing resilience. The mountains, which had once offered Erasmus and his companions sanctuary, now seemed to close in with menacing intent. The Roman patrols had grown more relentless, adapting to their evasive strategies with alarming speed. Every bend in the path, every shadowed gorge could conceal the enemy. Erasmus moved with calculated precision, his eyes scanning the rocks, listening for distant echoes of boots or the faint rattle of armor. Anxiety hummed through his companions, yet they drew strength from his calm demeanor. Erasmus knew that the greatest danger was not just physical capture, but the erosion of morale. Fear could fracture even the strongest will. He spoke constantly of patience, teaching them to transform dread into vigilance. Each day brought its own challenges: icy winds whipping across ridges, sudden rock slides triggered by the unstable terrain, and the omnipresent tension of Roman scouts combing every potential hiding place. Yet he maintained a spiritual discipline that was almost tangible, whispering prayers as he guided the group, his words a quiet beacon of hope. The bishop's understanding of human psychology became as crucial as his knowledge of the terrain. He divided the group into pairs for constant watch, instructed them to leave no trace of movement, and taught them subtle hand signals to communicate silently. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves was a potential threat, and Erasmus's companions became adept at reading the environment through his disciplined example. Small mistakes could spell disaster, but under his guidance they navigated the most treacherous passages unscathed. In a secluded valley, Erasmus discovered an abandoned shepherd's hut. The structure was fragile but offered temporary shelter. Inside, he organized supplies with meticulous care: dried herbs, small portions of grain, and water collected from nearby streams. He encouraged his companions to rest, not for comfort, but to restore the strength necessary for the trials ahead. At night, he would sit in quiet reflection, meditating and composing letters in his mind to distant Christian communities, seeking guidance and inspiration despite the isolation. The psychological burden of constant threat was compounded by the knowledge of the Roman Empire's brutality. Erasmus recounted the fate of other bishops and martyrs, using these narratives not to frighten, but to steel the hearts of his followers. He emphasized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. This teaching became a lifeline, a framework for endurance under conditions that would have broken ordinary men. A sudden report brought news of a small Roman contingent near a narrow gorge. Erasmus immediately assessed the situation. Retreating was risky. Advancing could lead to ambush. He chose a clever alternative, leading his companions along a barely visible ledge above the patrol. Each step required careful balance, every movement measured against the risk of exposure. The Romans below remained oblivious to the fugitive's presence, demonstrating the effectiveness of Erasmus's strategy and the value of patience under pressure. The bishop's ability to maintain spiritual composure under threat inspired awe. Even as they encountered sudden storms, washed-out paths, and hunger, he remained a calm, unwavering presence. In moments of extreme stress, he would pray aloud, offering words of encouragement and solace. These rituals strengthened both his own resolve and that of his companions. The mountains, though harsh and unyielding, became a proving ground where faith and strategy intertwined seamlessly. As the days passed, the Romans intensified their pursuit, employing trackers and scouts to anticipate every movement. Erasmus implemented diversions, smoke signals, misleading footprints, and temporary concealments. The psychological toll on the pursuers became evident as they encountered empty trails and traps. Erasmus' mastery of environment, human behavior, and strategic deception elevated him from fugitive to a tactical genius, his leadership forging resilience in the hearts of all who followed him. By the chapter's end, Erasmus and his companions had survived multiple close encounters, each testing their endurance, courage, and faith. The shadow of capture loomed constantly, yet it revealed the bishop's extraordinary capacity for leadership, psychological insight, and spiritual fortitude. His example demonstrated that survival was not merely a physical endeavor, but a holistic engagement of mind, body, and spirit. Despite their careful strategies, Erasmus and his companions could not evade Roman vigilance forever. Reports from spies and informants had revealed their mountain hideouts, and imperial commanders were determined to capture the elusive bishop. Each day the hunters drew closer, forcing Erasmus to navigate a dangerous labyrinth of cliffs, narrow passes, and hidden valleys. The air was thick with tension. Even the smallest misstep could spell disaster. The knowledge that his capture could shatter the faith of countless believers weighed heavily on his conscience. Erasmus often paused on the ridges, scanning distant valleys for signs of enemy movement. His companions, though trained in survival, depended entirely on his judgment. Anxiety was a constant companion, yet the bishop's calm presence served as a stabilizing force. He understood that courage was contagious. His steady gaze, deliberate movements, and soft-spoken counsel instilled confidence. He whispered prayers of protection, not only for himself but for those who followed him into the heart of danger. The Romans, relentless and methodical, began constructing traps and ambush points along predictable routes. Erasmus anticipated these maneuvers, altering paths at the last moment, using the natural terrain to shield their movements. Rocks, dense foliage, and sudden fog became allies in his tactical mind. Still, he knew that every delay could bring the pursuers closer, and the psychological strain on his companions was mounting. Fear of capture, hunger, and exhaustion gnawed at them. Yet Erasmus continually reminded them that faith and cunning were as vital as physical strength. One day, they stumbled upon a narrow gorge, the perfect ambush point. Erasmus noticed subtle signs: disturbed earth, displaced branches, and footprints that did not belong to their group. His heart quickened, but his voice remained steady as he ordered a detour along a precarious ledge. The companions moved silently, muscles taut, senses heightened. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig became a potential alarm. Erasmus's mind worked tirelessly, calculating angles, distances, and timing, transforming the fear of pursuit into a disciplined alertness. At night, they rested in a hidden cave, lit only by a small oil lamp. Erasmus tended to his companions' injuries and exhaustion, soothing frayed nerves with quiet conversation and reassurances. He encouraged them to speak of their fears not as complaints but as shared burdens to be met with courage. In these intimate moments, his leadership was not merely strategic. It was deeply personal, blending empathy with authority. Even the faintest whisper of doubt was met with guidance, turning anxiety into focused energy. As the Romans closed in, Erasmus sensed the inevitability of confrontation. He gathered his companions on a ridge overlooking a river valley, speaking not of escape but of endurance. "We may face capture," he said softly, "but our spirit is ours alone. No chains, no swords, no threats can take what is within us. Stand firm as I stand with you." His words, simple yet profound, fortified the hearts of all who listened. The storm of fear that had once threatened to overwhelm them was now channeled into unity and resolve. The following dawn brought the first signs of pursuit. Roman scouts moved cautiously along parallel ridges, their glinting armor catching the early light. Erasmus observed, calculated, and directed. Using smoke, reflections, and natural cover, he orchestrated diversions to mislead their trackers. Each maneuver required precision, patience, and psychological acuity. Companions followed every instruction, learning to read the landscape, anticipate enemy behavior, and master their own fear. These moments of high tension were punctuated by Erasmus's calm guidance, his eyes ever watchful, his presence an anchor amidst chaos. The climax approached when a group of Roman soldiers cornered them near a craggy cliffside. Erasmus remained composed, instructing his companions to hold their positions and maintain silence. His voice, calm yet commanding, directed movements with the authority of experience. The soldiers advanced cautiously, unaware of the subtle traps and diversions Erasmus had laid. In a display of tactical genius, the bishop led the Romans into a narrow passage where their numbers became a liability. Rocks and terrain constrained their movement, allowing the fugitives to evade direct confrontation. The psychological advantage lay with Erasmus, who had turned fear and danger into a test of discipline and ingenuity. Night fell with the threat still present, but temporarily evaded. Erasmus, though weary, spent hours in prayer and meditation, reflecting on the delicate balance between survival and moral responsibility. He composed mental letters to other Christian communities, emphasizing courage, vigilance, and faith under persecution. Sleep was brief, vigilance unending. The weight of leadership, the responsibility for lives, and the knowledge of impending trials created a crucible in which his faith and strategy were forged into something extraordinary. By the end of chapter 5, Erasmus had demonstrated not only spiritual fortitude, but also exceptional tactical acumen. The ever-present threat of capture and torture had sharpened his leadership, strengthened his companions, and reinforced the principle that resilience is as much a matter of mind as of body. Each challenge faced in these mountains was a preparation for the trials yet to come. Test not only of endurance but of unwavering conviction. In the face of imminent danger, the calm of the mountains could not last. Roman scouts had finally located Erasmus's hideout, and the bishop's vigilance, while extraordinary, could not prevent the inevitable. At dawn, the hunters descended like a shadow over the forested ridges, their disciplined formations leaving no escape. Erasmus sensed the closing net, the tightening grip of fate. He gathered his companions, whispering instructions with deliberate calm. "Hold your positions," he said, "but prepare for the trials ahead. Our faith and wits must guide us." His eyes, dark and piercing, reflected both determination and the sorrow of knowing capture was near. The Romans approached with confidence, believing their numbers would overwhelm any resistance. Erasmus used the terrain to delay their advance, sending small diversions to confuse and scatter the pursuers. Rocks dislodged from cliffs, sudden smoke from hidden fires, and misdirected tracks bought precious moments. The tension among his companions was palpable. Faces pale, hands trembling, hearts pounding. Erasmus remained the anchor. Each word, each gesture was measured to instill courage. He knew that fear could be transformed into discipline, that panic could be sculpted into focused action. Despite these precautions, the trap was unavoidable. Near a narrow gorge, a contingent of Roman soldiers blocked all exits. Erasmus, calculating swiftly, recognized the futility of escape. His heart ached not for himself, but for the believers who depended on his leadership. The psychological weight of responsibility pressed heavily. He whispered prayers, invoking divine strength not for survival alone, but for guidance in the moments of testing to come. The bishop's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the mounting terror around him. The Romans advanced cautiously, wary of ambushes. Erasmus held his companions close, instructing them to maintain silence and composure. His sharp eyes scanned every detail, the angle of sunlight on rocks, the glint of armor, the subtle shifts in movement. When the first soldier neared, Erasmus stepped forward, unarmed, his expression serene yet resolute. His presence commanded attention, a psychological assertion of authority despite physical vulnerability. The soldiers hesitated, unsettled by the bishop's unwavering confidence. Capture came with minimal struggle. Erasmus allowed himself to be bound, his hands and feet secured while his companions followed. The Romans, confident in their numerical superiority, failed to notice the subtle aura of resilience radiating from the bishop. As they marched through the rocky passes, Erasmus spoke softly to his companions, reinforcing the importance of courage and spiritual focus. Every word, a tether to faith, every gesture, a lesson in endurance under duress. By mid-afternoon, they reached the Roman camp, a temporary installation with guards, tents, and watchtowers. Erasmus was presented to local officials, and the psychological tension escalated. Roman commanders sought to break him before formal execution, employing intimidation, threats, and displays of force. Yet Erasmus maintained calm dignity. His gaze never wavered. His words carried authority, conviction, and compassion. Even some guards found themselves secretly moved by his presence. The firmness of his faith challenging their assumptions about human resilience and divine protection. Over the next days, Erasmus endured intense interrogations designed to weaken his resolve. He was reminded of the power of the empire, shown the instruments of torture, and threatened with gruesome deaths. The bishop, however, responded not with fear but with measured speech, often redirecting conversations to philosophical and theological matters, emphasizing moral integrity, the transient nature of earthly power, and the eternal significance of steadfast faith. His companions observed in awe, learning the subtle ways that courage and wisdom could shield the soul even when the body was vulnerable. The psychological strategy of the Romans reached a critical point when they attempted to isolate Erasmus completely. Separated from his companions, confined to a dimly lit chamber, he faced the prospect of physical torture and public execution. Darkness pressed in from all sides, yet Erasmus found clarity in prayer. He imagined the faces of his flock, the prayers of the faithful across the empire, and the enduring strength of those who had suffered before him. This mental fortitude became a shield, preserving not only hope but a sense of purpose in the face of imminent danger. Finally, the stage was set for the first public trial. Roman officials brought Erasmus into the open square, the heart of the local city where a crowd gathered. Soldiers, magistrates, and curious citizens surrounded him. The bishop, still calm, spoke not of fear or defiance but of love, mercy, and moral truth. His voice, clear and unwavering, carried across the square, drawing the attention of those who had come to witness a display of imperial power. Even within the crowd, some began to question the authority and justice of their rulers, moved by the courage and composure of a single man facing ultimate peril. As the day progressed, it became evident that the execution, planned as a spectacle to terrify, had an unintended effect. The very people meant to be cowed were inspired, their admiration mingling with apprehension. The psychological battlefield had shifted. Erasmus' capture had not broken the community. Instead, it intensified resolve. Observers whispered among themselves, pondering the courage of a man who embraced potential suffering rather than compromise principle. The bishop's presence had transformed fear into reflection, intimidation into awe. The chapter closes with Erasmus, bound but unbowed, aware that the true trial was only beginning. His mind remained sharp, his spirit resolute, and his prayers continuous. He understood that martyrdom, should it come, would be both a personal trial and a beacon for believers across the empire. The psychological pressure of the capture, the looming threat of torture, and the awareness of a watching populace coalesced into a crucible of character, forging the bishop into a symbol of unwavering faith, strategic acumen, and enduring human resilience. The sun had barely risen when Erasmus was led to the central square, the heart of Formiae. The cobblestones were slick with morning dew, glinting under the pale sunlight. The citizens, bound by curiosity and fear, gathered to witness the fate of the man who had defied Rome itself. Roman soldiers, disciplined and grim, formed a barrier between Erasmus and the crowd. He walked with measured steps, his hands bound yet his posture unyielding. Each stride echoed his inner strength, a silent declaration that the spirit could not be chained even when the body was restrained. The first torment was subtle but deliberate. Soldiers prodded him with rods, not yet to inflict fatal pain but to elicit fear and doubt. Erasmus remained composed, his face a mask of serenity. He spoke softly, words of comfort to his companions and onlookers, emphasizing moral truth and divine protection. Some spectators gasped at the calm defiance of the bishop. Others whispered prayers for courage. The psychological battle had begun, and Erasmus wielded it with the precision of a seasoned leader. Next, he was placed before the apparatus of the barrel of nails, a device designed to crush, pierce, and humiliate. The crowd murmured in anticipation. Yet, rather than recoil in terror, Erasmus observed the construction with analytical clarity. He calculated the physics of its rotation, the distribution of force, and mentally prepared for the ordeal. His internal dialogue, a mixture of prayer and strategic reasoning, became a shield against despair. The Romans, confident in the inevitability of his suffering, failed to anticipate the profound resilience emanating from a single human presence. The moment came. The barrel rolled down the hillside, the sound of metal against wood echoing through the valley. Inside, Erasmus braced himself, every muscle coiled, yet his mind remained calm. He focused on breath, prayer, and the enduring principle that earthly pain could not touch the soul. Witnesses later described an aura of unshakable serenity surrounding the barrel's descent, a phenomenon that stirred confusion and awe among the soldiers and townspeople alike. The psychological spectacle rivaled any physical terror. When the barrel came to a halt, soldiers approached, expecting a mutilated corpse. Instead, they found Erasmus alive, bloodied but conscious, eyes steady, voice clear. His composure was unsettling, a living testament that the human spirit could withstand what the body seemed incapable of enduring. The Roman officials convened, muttering about divine interference and the unpredictability of fear. For the citizens, a seed of doubt about imperial authority took root, nurtured by the astonishing survival of their bishop. Erasmus was returned to confinement, not to rest but to be presented with more elaborate tortures. The psychological weight intensified as he was subjected to mock executions, displays of instruments of agony, and threats designed to break his resolve. Yet the bishop's mind was a fortress. He meditated on the nature of suffering, the eternal reward of fidelity, and the broader impact of courage in inspiring others. His inner narrative turned fear into discipline, dread into an instrument of moral teaching. A particularly grueling ordeal involved immersion in boiling oil. Witnesses described the air thick with steam and the metallic scent of heated instruments. Erasmus' body was prepared according to Roman procedures meant to inflict agony, yet he emerged unscathed, a phenomenon attributed by contemporaries to divine protection. This miraculous survival further unnerved the soldiers and captivated the populace, creating a blend of fear, admiration, and spiritual wonder. Some soldiers reportedly began questioning the very power they had sworn to enforce, their loyalty shaken by the undeniable presence of what they perceived as supernatural intervention. Word of these miraculous escapes spread rapidly. Pilgrims, local believers, and curious citizens traveled from distant towns to witness Erasmus. His sermons, delivered despite confinement, emphasized forgiveness, moral courage, and the transient nature of earthly suffering. The psychological dimension of martyrdom became central. The bishop's ability to endure and instruct under duress amplified his authority, transforming fear into inspiration and persecution into testimony. Roman authorities grew increasingly desperate. Emperor Maximian, notorious for his cruelty, demanded an execution that would be undeniable in its finality. Preparations for public display intensified. Altars were constructed, witnesses assembled, and priests of the Roman pantheon invoked to demonstrate imperial supremacy. Yet the very anticipation of torture, the display of power meant to intimidate, served to magnify Erasmus's symbolic significance. The bishop's composure, humility, and eloquence rendered the spectacle less a demonstration of Rome's might, and more a moral contest whose outcome transcended physicality. During these trials, Erasmus composed letters to other Christian communities, fragments of which would survive to posterity. These writings conveyed strategic insights, theological reflections, and encouragement for enduring faith under persecution. Each missive, sent through clandestine channels, reinforced his role as spiritual anchor even while his body was captive. The integration of psychological resilience, moral clarity, and practical guidance established Erasmus not only as a martyr, but as an exemplar of leadership amid extreme adversity. The chapter concludes with Erasmus awaiting the next trial, bound, yet unwavering. The combination of anticipation, divine mystery, and moral authority solidified his presence as a figure whose courage transcended mere survival. He had become an embodiment of steadfast faith, psychological mastery, and the enduring power of spiritual conviction against overwhelming oppression. The city of Formier was alive with anticipation. Word had spread that Bishop Erasmus, the man who had defied Rome's might, would face his final trial. Citizens, soldiers, and officials filled the central square, their voices blending into a tense hum. The morning sun reflected off the polished cobblestones, illuminating the grandeur and terror of the moment. All eyes were fixed on the man whose resilience had become legendary. Erasmus walked to the execution site with steady steps, his body fatigued from previous tortures, yet his spirit unbroken. He was dressed in a simple brown robe, slightly tattered from confinement, but his presence radiated dignity. Chains rattled softly around his wrists, a metallic accompaniment to the rhythm of his heartbeat. The crowd sensed the gravity of the occasion. The thin line between life and death stretched taut across the square. The executioners had prepared a device known as the windlass, designed to inflict excruciating suffering by slowly extracting the victim's intestines. The mechanism, cruel in design yet precise in its operation, glistened under the morning light. Spectators murmured, some averting their eyes, others drawn by morbid curiosity. Erasmus's calm gaze swept over the assembly, resting briefly on familiar faces among his followers. In that moment, his mind focused on forgiveness, on the purpose of suffering, and on the eternal nature of faith. As the procedure began, Erasmus positioned himself on the wooden table. The executioners worked with methodical precision, turning the windlass with relentless intent, yet Erasmus's expression remained serene. Each rotation, each pull, each mechanical movement of the device was met with inner prayer and reflection. He spoke quietly, not of his pain, but of hope, forgiveness, and divine love. The psychological courage he exhibited was as potent as any physical resistance, challenging the very assumptions of the Roman officials about fear and human endurance. Witnesses later recounted that Erasmus's final words were a prayer of thanksgiving, not for deliverance but for the privilege of martyrdom. He asked forgiveness for those carrying out the execution, expressing gratitude for the chance to affirm his faith. His composure inspired awe, and for many, this ultimate act of defiance and devotion became a profound moral exemplar. Some onlookers reportedly felt a spiritual awakening, questioning the authority of emperors and the cruelty imposed in the name of power. With his passing, a silence fell over Formier. The city seemed to pause, as if acknowledging the transformation of a man into a symbol. News of Erasmus's martyrdom spread quickly, reaching distant towns and coastal villages. Sailors prayed to him for safe voyages, drawing connections between his steadfastness and their perilous journeys at sea. Communities inspired by his courage found renewed strength, while Roman authorities grappled with the failure to extinguish the spiritual flame he had ignited. In the years that followed, the legacy of Erasmus grew. Pilgrims traveled from afar to venerate the site of his martyrdom. His story became entwined with legends of miraculous survival, divine intervention, and moral fortitude. The image of a man enduring unimaginable pain without yielding became a touchstone for Christian identity, teaching that true authority lay not in temporal power, but in the steadfastness of conscience and the courage to uphold one's beliefs in the face of tyranny. Medieval chroniclers expanded upon the tale, drawing parallels between Erasmus' suffering and broader struggles between church and state. His endurance was cited in theological debates, moral instruction, and artistic representations, reinforcing the idea that spiritual resilience could surpass even the most extreme physical oppression. The neoclassical imagery of Erasmus's life and death, with its focus on dignity, suffering, and divine purpose, permeated art, literature, and liturgy for centuries. Even in the modern era, the story of Erasmus continues to resonate. Scholars of theology, psychology, and history examine the interplay of mind and body, courage and fear, belief and action in his martyrdom. Contemporary discussions on resilience, the placebo effect, and human endurance often reference historical examples like Erasmus, highlighting the power of inner conviction to transcend physical limitations. His legacy serves as both an inspiration and a reminder of the profound cost of integrity. The final tableau of Erasmus's life is thus more than the story of a man tortured and executed. It is the narrative of moral triumph over oppression, of faith unyielding in the face of mortal danger, and of the enduring human capacity to embody principles greater than oneself. The echoes of his courage reverberate across centuries, challenging each generation to consider the meaning of devotion, the cost of conscience, and the strength found in spiritual fidelity.